So, what is a cause list, and how can anybody, a general public, can see where their matter is going to come up?
So, especially after COVID and even in the recent past, there has been a phenomenal process.
So, a lot of your junior colleagues and interns must be from Gen Z generation, right? So, how does it feel working with them, and how it's different from your generation?
I think that's a very interesting question in the current time, especially because, in fact, it was like a dream come true because we've always heard about Ram Jethmalani. We've always like kind of read about Ram sir. So meeting him was, of course, a dream.
Welcome back to Why Law, the podcast that breaks down the law for anyone who has ever wanted to understand it or been too intimidated to ask. Whether you are a law student, a young lawyer, or just someone curious about what actually goes inside India's highest court, this one is for you. I am your host, Varsha Gupta, and this is powered by Bettering Results. Today's guest has built something rare, an independent practice at the Supreme Court of India. And she did not start where you might expect. No national law university, no family pedigree. Everyone assumes you need. She studied law at Barkatullah University in Bhopal and built her way up from there, one internship, one brief, and one case at a time. Along the way, she interned with some of the biggest names the profession has ever seen. Ram Jethmalani, Justice Deepak Mishra, Mr. Mohan Parasaran. She went on to work as a senior associate at Shardul Amarchand Mangaldas and Company, one of India's top tier law firms, before walking away from that stability to build her own chambers, Tanvi Dubey and Associates. Today, Tanvi Dubey is an advocate on record at the Supreme Court of India, one of a select group of lawyers who are authorized to directly file before the Honorable Supreme Court. She was part of the legal team in the historic 9 judge Sabrimala bench matter, and more recently, she represented the Federation of All India Medical Association in the NEET UG case, one of the most closely watched matters in this country, with lakhs of students and their families following every hearing. In this episode, she's going to take us inside all of it, what it actually takes to build a Supreme Court practice from scratch, what preparing for a 9 judge constitutional bench really looks like, what she learned representing a nation's worth of anxious students, and what she makes of a new generation of lawyers walking into the profession that's changing faster than ever. This is Why Law, powered by Bettering Results. Tanvi Dubey, welcome. Your story is very inspiring for any lawyer, who's watching this podcast, because you are living the dreams that, everybody thinks of when they are joining law school. So everybody assumes that you need an NLU tag and you need a family background to be able to appear before the Honorable Supreme Court. You had neither. You came from Barkatullah University in Bhopal, right? So how does that impossible path actually happen for you?
Thank you, Varsha, for your very kind words. I'd start by saying that coming from Bhopal and building my legal journey in Delhi was actually has a very detailed trajectory, so to say. Because when I started my law in the initial first year, I also never thought that I'll come to Delhi, I establish my practice. I was just going with the flow, like I'm in first year, I have to give my exams. I'll go to the second year, I'll give my exams. So like every other law student. But the pattern in my university, most of the people were preparing for mostly civil judge examinations, and most of them, like 80% of the batch, was preparing for judiciary. So I had also been informed that and told that this is what usually is the path which people follow after during the law school, and after that they write the examination. I also did started to prepare, but then that was something that did not interested me too much. I mean, I also thought that there was a lot of anxiousness within me to also explore and try different avenues of law, see how the practice goes in trial court, see how practice goes in high court, rather than from the very inception start preparing for the examination without any knowledge or experience in law. So for me, I thought that it's required to also get that experience, so to say. So actually, I just spoke with a trial court, a very renowned lawyer there, and I said, I really want to see how it looks like. I just want to see the court files. I want to read the briefs. I want to see how the evidence is recorded, what happens exactly in the courtroom. And he was very kind. He said that yes, please, let you can do the internship. And then I started off in my first year with him. Until date, I'm very well connected with his chambers, and whenever I visit Bhopal, we definitely meet him. So, and the very first stage itself, when I opened the first file during that internship, I thought that this is a different world altogether, a very different world from what the picture you get in the classrooms or in the college. So law school will never teach you what the courtroom would actually look like. For that, you will have to go there and see how it would look like. So I would give all the credits to all the internships, which of course started from trial court, and gradually I did an internship in the High Court, and that also built my interest to come to Delhi and do a Supreme Court internship, and which of course was revolutionary because that changed my thinking altogether towards law and towards dimensions and also towards the avenues one would have after doing 5 years law. So I would say that it was a trajectory in itself, and also experiences taught me a lot. And as you said, coming from a non NLU background, the only thing which helped me throughout, which I can say with no doubt, is internships, which really helped me a lot and which really helped me to understand the world which is, beyond the law school, and also a world which would make you understand what you eventually would like to do. Because, law school is a very, you're at a very, very nascent stage of your career to really decide what you would eventually want to do. But it internships helps you analyze as to what's your experience, what's your expertise like, what's your interest like. And I think for me, that was a major game changer in terms of not being from a NLU and making this journey so far.
Right. So, is there anyone in your family who inspired you to pursue law?
Yes, definitely. My father is also a lawyer in Bhopal. So, I mean, I grew up in that environment, seeing the law book, seeing those type of conversations, seeing him dealing with the clients, seeing him going to the courts. But when you come to Delhi, you really start from scratch, is what I have seen in my experience. So, although as I said that it really helped me to kind of build that foundation. It really helped me to, because you grew up in seeing all of that. You grew up seeing the law books. You grew up seeing those kind of, you have on the lunch or a dinner table, you'll have those conversations. But necessarily that doesn't help you to build a law career in Delhi. So here, I think it really, one would have to work from scratch and work it through when you decide to build your career in Delhi.
Right, I definitely agree with you, especially the internships part that you mentioned, and that's something which can set anybody apart as a law student, even if they are not from NLU. So, a lot of students, have this, there is this myth about needing an NLU tag. So, would you like to bust this myth for the students who are watching this?
I'd say that law school, when it comes to NLUs, you may have certain added advantages. Like you have a placement cell, you have an internship cell, you have a very good and a strong alumni network, so to say, when it comes to placements or recruitments or anything for that matter. I hear from a lot of my friends who are from NLUs that someone wants an internship, they posted on an alumni group, and they like seek some contacts, and then they'll find some way out. However, from a non-NLU, you really have to do things on your own. You really have to pull all your strings, and you have to start from scratch. You have to find your own way. You have to meet people. You have to develop your own network. And also, I would say that a lot of things which kind of build your initial journey, that is self-driven when it comes to your internships, or when it also comes to adopting like very strong reading habits or very strong uh, habits when it comes to kind of reading a brief or meeting people. So all of that is, as I said, it's a self-driven process when it comes to a non-NLU setup.
Right. So, if a law graduate today has to start their career, how do they start? Like with having no background, anything, what their path should be like?
So I would say it's a very interesting question, and I can really spend hours to speak on this question. I would say initially there has to be a roadmap. There's no second thought and there's no two way about it. You have to have a roadmap. I mean, your planning can go a little bit here and there. That's fine. You can't, in first year of law school, decide whether you want to pursue civil law, criminal law, corporate, or litigation. But then, initial roadmap as to how you're going to bifurcate your journey, so to say, in the sense of internships, because there are many people, recently there's someone who had approached me for an internship, and when I saw the CV, that person was already graduated 2 years back. I said, you're already, during your law school, have you not pursued any internships? He said, no, I had no idea. There was no kind of mentor or anyone who guided me through the process. And I think which is where a lot of people lack, because they don't create that, or they don't have a roadmap for those 5 years, which is very important. Uh, there has Everyone says that a trial court internship is very important. You can't directly come and intern in the Supreme Court because you'll be lost. People won't understand what's
Right.
going on
Hmm.
at the apex level. But then, even at the trial court, I think a lot of people realized it at their third year or a fourth year that, okay, like let's do some few internships at least to put in something in our CV,
Hmm.
which becomes very dangerous because. I mean, towards your end of your journey in the law school in fourth year or fifth year, if you're doing a trial court internship, there's pretty much no time left for a high court or a Supreme Court internship or a law firm internship. So I think if you create a roadmap, at least you have an idea as to largely how much time you want to bifurcate in the internships, how much time you want to bifurcate in other curricular activities, like in whether it's like going for moot courts, whether it's writing research papers. So I think planning really helps a lot while you create at least a structure of how do you want to plan things.
So, there is an exam which a lot of people outside law will not know about, AIB, right? So, what happens if you don't clear AIB?
Thing. I mean, as simple, you won't be able to practice after your temporary registration expires. You won't be able to practice, and that's kind of a mandatory requirement where people will have to clear the AIB to begin with.
And has it become tougher now, or it's same?
Yes, it has. That's what I also heard from my, chamber colleagues who wrote, who were interning with us for a long duration and wrote this exam and just cleared it. So this time it was not that easy. So people are studying for it, unlike few years where people just like studied overnight and gave the exam next morning. So it's I think there has been some kind of strictness in the syllabus.
So, like you have worked in a law firm as well as right now you are practicing independently, right? So, when it comes to choosing between litigation or say corporate law career, a lot of young lawyers are worried whether they should go for litigation or corporate. So, how they should take that decision?
I think, as I said earlier, the key answer is always experimentations. And as I say experimentations, I mean that you need to kind of go and see what happens. So, for example, when I was in first year, someone told me that uh, he or she got a very fancy corporate law internship. I would not know that. I mean, I really don't know, have an idea what kind of work is done there. So I think to really gauge or come to a conclusion whether you want to end up doing corporate or litigation, those 5 years are very, very crucial to go experiment, see what kind of work is done. Like, for example, when I was in my law school, I was interning in Amarchand, and that was my first internship before I started to work there after my graduation. And my first internship, I was a little lost because I didn't know what kind of structure the firm follows, who you have to report to, what is the timeline you have to submit your work in. And also, there are various things where you are kind of lost. And then gradually you kind of understand and get into the flow. One more thing which I think is very important to tell the viewers and especially the students is that they think that number of internships in the resume means more than quality and more time they are spending in those internships. So there are many people who may have 20 internships by the end of fifth year, and but then they've spent just 20 days or 2 weeks or 3 weeks or a month in those chambers or in those law firms. And when you go back and really rewind as to you remember any work that you've done in that office, there's literally nothing that one would recall because the time duration is so short that you would end up not really meeting say the advocate you're interning with or the law firm partner you're interning with. So I think the best way also is to kind of try and get a callback internship or get an extension or speak with the person you're interning with if you like the work that I'm really keen to work here after my graduation. So at times people also extend your internships and kind of you intern at the same place before you start working. So that also helps. I've seen a lot of people who have interned at the places before they start working there. That gives them a lot more advantage because they know the work cycle, they know the kind of work, they know what kind of involvement they will have, they know largely the the lifestyle, and also the kind of work that office does primarily. So I think that helps a lot in terms of when you start working there, and it's not like a totally a new environment. So I think when it comes to quality versus quantity, it should always be quality, and one should always spend more time in that office rather than having numbers in their CVs just for the sake of it.
No, absolutely agreed with you. And there's something a lot of law students are, running after collecting internship certificates, as you rightly mentioned that, 20 internships versus 5 good internship is something that, we
Definitely.
should be aiming for. So it's something that, law students should definitely take care of. So almost every Indian threatens to take it to the Honorable Supreme Court at some point or the other. But if we are honest, nobody actually knows what that means. So can you tell us, like, what does it mean when somebody has to take matter to the Supreme Court?
So I'll tell you from a perspective of a client, like, because as an advocate on record, you can directly interact with the client, you draft the case, you file it. So from a client's perspective, it is the highest stake which is involved and at the highest level, like, there's no court above this. So there's a lot of stake involved when it comes to a client. And also, I mean, every case which comes to Supreme Court has a history. I mean, there can be writ petitions under Article 32 which are directly filed. There are PILs which are directly filed. But other than that, majority of the matters come from the High Court. They already have a history when under Article 136, the SLPs are filed in the Supreme Court. And for that matter, any other court. So 36 says that from any order of any court. So, as I said, that every case which comes to Supreme Court has a history behind it. And when you look at the case history and when you go deep down into the case history, you know that you are arguing at the apex level, which is going to see the trial court record, which is going to see the high court record, and finally it's going to adjudicate your matter. So it's not very easy in terms of kind of pleading your case in a SLP because you have to take care of the findings which are against you. If I'm a petitioner, obviously I lost before the High Court and I'm before the Supreme Court in a SLP. So one has to be very, very careful while drafting a SLP before the Supreme Court. And I think every case comes with its own history when it reaches the Supreme Court.
So in case rights are violated, fundamental rights, right? So can you directly approach the Supreme Court in that case, or you have to take it through the High Court first?
No, I think under Article 32, one can directly approach the Supreme Court. In fact, there has been a very, very deep legislation on PILs also, which started somewhere around late 1970s. And there are PILs also entertained by the Supreme Court, and which started way back when, even a letter was treated as a petition. And there are landmark judgments of Justice P.N. Bhagwati on this. And they have Justice Krishna Iyer, Justice P.N. Bhagwati, there are various judgments on this. So when the case reaches the Supreme Court, and if, for example, if my fundamental right is violated, I can always approach the Supreme Court under Article 32, and one can always plead what rights are violated, whether it's right to life, whether it's right to livelihood, whether it's equality. You have to plead, and which is where you can directly approach and fight your case in the Supreme Court.
So from this, like you mentioned about PIL, right? A lot of PILs are being filed before the Supreme Court. So who can actually file a PIL, and do you think it is also misused a lot of times?
Yes, I would answer the second question first. It is misused, and there are many judgments which categorically also states that it has to be used very justly, and it can't be, there can't be abuse of process by filing PILs. And PIL jurisdiction, as I said, evolved in late 1970s, and it's something that we keep seeing almost every day. You just name a public issue, and it's been heard by the Supreme Court. And the urgent hearings happens of the PILs also. So it's also filed under Article 32, although there is a little bit of variation in terms of procedural, how to file a PIL. But we do see PILs being directly filed in the Supreme Court.
So here is a credential that most people outside law will not have any idea of, which is AOR, right? And no case can be filed in the Supreme Court without an AOR. So can you tell us what is an AOR and how does this entire system function?
So AOR, the powers of the AOR, of course, the concept of the AOR in Article 145, the Supreme Court has the power, and of course the Supreme Court rules, which are recently amended. The last amended rules are of 2013. As per the rules, AOR has the power to AOR is the lawyer who does the filings in the Supreme Court. No other lawyer can file in the Supreme Court. AOR can also file the wakalatnama. So no other lawyer can file the wakalatnama. AOR is the authorized lawyer to file the wakalatnama and also plead the case on behalf of the client. So no senior lawyer can do that. No other lawyer can do that. So AOR has the powers under the Supreme Court rules to file the wakalatnama and to plead the case, to draft the case. So every case, every pleading you see that drawn and filed by. So always the AOR's name is there when it comes to filed by. You have AOR's name. So no other lawyer who is not a AOR cannot have that filing done. Also, there's a AOR code which is given to every lawyer, every AOR. That's also in each filing which you do. And now with the virtual portals, it's very convenient because all the filings can happen by your login ID and your email ID, and all the filings happen, and then every AOR has their registered portals, and then you can monitor your filings, monitor the defects, whether it's cleared when it's supposed to be listed. So all of that has also now there's been a revolutionary change after the changes in technology.
So a lot of lawyers, aspire to become an AOR. So can you tell us how many years of practice they require? What is the exam like, and is there any training that they need to do before they can appear for the exam?
So yes, I mean, when I started my preparation, I was told that do you have the first question? I was told by a very senior AOR when I went to her that I'm planning to write the exam. So the first question she asked me is, "How's your handwriting? Have you written something before, like at least a few months before, or are you in a writing practice?" I said, "No, absolutely not." So she advised me that please start to write, even your briefing notes or whatever you're doing. Please start to write because that's the key, and that's something that we really forget after graduation, because you are just like tuck tuck tuck, you're on your laptop and you're just like arguing, so you just forget the writing habits. So I think primarily whosoever wants to write the AOR exam should really switch on to a usual writing habit, which is really must. After that, I feel people who are already practicing in the Supreme Court, drafting paper is not a problem because you're pretty much drafting SLPs and writ petitions every day. So that's something that the only tricky thing is speed when it comes to drafting. So one has to monitor the speed. One has to monitor that how much time they have to, kind of devote to each pleadings. Because once you're in the flow of preparing a petition, you just forget that there are 4 or 5 questions also you have to attend. So I think the trick in the drafting paper is speed, also plus the writing habit. Also, you have to memorize few things, because once you start drafting the petition, you just start with the synopsis and you just start with the grounds, questions of law, and that's how you generally draft. But while you appear for the examination, you really have to start from scratch in the Supreme Court of India. And all of that, you have to memorize all the rules, you have to memorize the jurisdiction, the performer of listing. All of that is something that you have to memorize when you prepare for the exam. And after that, so there are 4 papers in total. You have a drafting paper, you have leading cases, practice and procedure, and ethics. Again, practice and procedure is, I think there are rules, Supreme Court rules, which are very helpful. Also, there's a guide, a book, which is on the website also, uh, for Supreme Court practice and procedure, which is immensely helpful. There are other material as well. So practice, procedure, ethics is again something that one majorly knows that, and either you've read in the law school, or practice procedure also, you somehow, like on my first day when I started my career, I never knew that there are separate set of Supreme Court rules.
Right.
So that was something very new to me. So when I prepared for the AOR exam, I was told that start reading the rules so that you at least know and get an idea about these rules. And that was very helpful, because when you start practicing there, you should have an idea of the rules. It's very, very important.
So AORs are often called the nervous system of the Supreme Court. So can you take us through behind the scenes of drafting SLP, writ petition?
So yes, I mean, as I said that when a case reaches Supreme Court, majorly the draftings which are done in any office, of course, are of SLPs. There are writs and there are PILs, but then the major work is drafting a specially petition. If you are a petitioner, you've already lost before the High Court when you're approaching the Supreme Court. What I feel, primarily, major emphasis should be on the synopsis and on the list of dates, because that's something that really gives a picture of your entire case. uh, you have to prepare, like, a kind of the best points in the synopsis. You have to put your case, you have to, in a manner of a story, which is how it's very easy for anyone to understand your case, that this is what was the High Court finding, this is what is these are the major grounds for the SLP. And this is what, if you're asking for a stay, then these are the grounds for stay. So if that's very well encapsulated in the synopsis, I think it also interests the judge. And while arguing also, it's very easy, because you directly refer to the synopsis and tell the judge while arguing that these are the points, these are the grounds, which are also of course set afterwards, but primarily this is the case. So a lot of emphasis, as I said, is number one on the synopsis. Secondly, when you draft a petition, I think many people adopt, everyone, like there's no standard way or mechanism which you can pick up to draft a petition or a SLP or any Supreme Court drafting for that matter. But as I said, that largely there has to be a strategy which you build. Like if your team is sitting and say a client approaches and with the impugned order that I've lost in the High Court, I want to approach the Supreme Court, then primarily you need to make your own bullet points of where the High Court went wrong and where your client is right. I think that really helps you prepare your entire case, because on a admission hearing in Supreme Court, you really don't get that much time to explain your entire case. But then, obviously, like in the sense of limited time window, if you prepare those five main pointers, that helps you a lot when you argue the case. And I think things get easier while drafting if you kind of have those 5 points. At times, many a times, what happens is that when you are briefing a senior counsel, when you open the SLP and you realize that, okay, we've missed on the most important 4 points, and let's just file a few additional documents, let's try and bring those points on record. So I think the journey or the entire process becomes easier if a discussion happens primarily before starting the draft as to what will be the strategy, what are the grounds, what are the main issues in the impugned order, and then the drafting takes place. Like, I mean, while I was in the law firm, we really had some 4 processes where the draft was vetted and finally it was sent to the for approval to the client, and we used to file it. So a associate would draft it, then a senior associate would see it, then a PA would see, then of course the partner will finally give his inputs, and then it may again go through some change of revisions of kind of.
So how is it different for you now that you're practicing independently? Those layers of review aren't there.
Yeah, so again, it's a lot of responsibility. I
Yes.
think it's a very good question, because you really have to. When I also shifted from SAM to my own practice, I also thought that, I mean, that's what I tell my junior colleagues, that please bring a draft which it should not be like I also start from scratch. So what we nowadays do is that we sit and have the preliminary discussion so that they also know that what's my take on it, and I also sense what they are thinking, and then we kind of work in a manner that all the points are incorporated from the very inception, so that a draft doesn't go a major change as
Correct.
such, or when it's when it reaches me. So it should not be like entire strategy is changed as such. So it was a great shift. I mean, I would say that when I started my own practice, it was. Uh, I mean, I felt at times that it was like one person running the show. So you have to deal with the client, you have to draft, you have to also coordinate with the clerk whether it's filed, when it's listed. So it was a great learning, but then still I would say that a lot of responsibility also at the same time.
So how do you manage all of this? Like, for anybody who wants to practice independently, their major challenge is that how do I get clients? How do I manage all the work myself, right? So for years they don't practice independently and they prefer working with a senior. So with you, how were you able to manage everything?
I think, first of all, I don't see a substitute to hard work, and there's a lot of toiling, there is a lot of running around. In terms of when you start your own practice from an established job in a law firm, there are a lot of questions which one would have, because you already have a very balanced life and you're leaving that life to go into a life full of rush madness, but also something which also gives you a kind of satisfaction because it's your own work. You can take different briefs. There's no restriction as such. So I feel, for me, yes, juggling was there. There were days when I started my office, I was just like on my Google Pay every day, like paying the clerk, paying my office rent, paying the printer, paying the office boy. So I was like, what's this happening? And how will I bring a setup into place, or things at peace? But eventually, what I also learned from many people around me who started their own practice, they said that give 6 months to it. If you sustain 6 months, then automatically you will be able to deal. Have like go with the pace, and at least give it some time. So I think that really helped me, because mentally I also thought that I have to give this 6 months breather. I really don't have to think about anything. I should really focus on my work, minimize expenses, of course, because if you've started your own, you're not getting a law firm salary as such.
Yes.
So minimize your expenses, but then have hope, have faith, because there are people who, I mean, if they enter into litigation in the primary years, in the first year or second year, and they really get disheartened that this how will I survive, especially in a city like Delhi. So they just lose all hopes and then they switch completely from litigation. I think that's something that I have also learned with time, that there has to be a lot of patience and there has to be some kind of hope in the entire process, because it is a time consuming process, and it's not like you'll just get a overnight success in your first year or second year. There may be some really good case where you get a very good order. That's always an exception. But then primarily you won't get an overnight success. It's such a profession which needs a lot of running around, a lot of hard work. With this, I started my practice, and when I also heard from my mentors how much years they also spent into it, how much time, devotion they have also given into it. So I think the same kind of lessons I used to apply and kind of just be
That kept
hopeful
you
in the
motivated also.
process.
Okay. So a litigant's case can, sit for months.
When it comes to a litigant kind of examining or seeing what's in development in his case, because Supreme Court website has access to anyone who has his case number, who has, even by the petitioner's name or a respondent name, case search, they can search their own case. And also when you click on your case and go to that page where you find the case details, you literally see everything. You see the next date, tentative date of hearing, you see what's filed, where are the orders. So all of it is actually available just by a click. Just that people don't know how to kind of search it by the case number or petitioner's number. And also, as you referred about cause list, so we have cause list which is regularly updated. Like a miscellaneous list is generally out 3 or 4 days in advance when your actual case is listed, and you have a supplementary list which comes out an evening before, like 7:30. You'll have the supplementary list of matters which are like the urgent matters which are listed the very next day. So I think, but nowadays I've seen that many clients would know more than a lawyer. They keep a track more than you do, because they keep telling me that tentative dates it's showing like
Okay.
so and so, and then do you think our matter is going to reach? So I think nowadays they are very prompt in terms of searching what's the case history is like and what's happening and what's the next date.
So if you ask 10 people, how much time a Supreme Court matter is going to take, everybody is going to give different answers. Like, so according to you, how much time does it usually take, and why is everybody's expectation so different?
I think there's no realistic answer to it. But I'll tell you how generally things move, because a lot of people have the perception that Tariq pe Tariq thing is going on
Yes.
forever. But it's not like that, because there are category of cases. If you go for an admission hearing, if your case, a notice is issued in your case, that's firstly the entry step. If it's dismissed on the first day, then obviously there's no following dates of hearing. But then, if a notice is issued in your case, and if the court if the case goes ahead, then also there are admission hearings. So, like if a civil appeal has been admitted, it goes into the regular cause list. Now, in the regular cause list, you really have to keep a tap on when it's been finally heard. But then there are now options and avenues to mention a matter. So whenever there's a old matter, or when there's some urgency, there are protocols to mention the matter by writing a letter. There's a set performer for mentioning. You write a letter, you mention the reasons of urgency in that letter, and then that letter is, if it's entertained, then you get the listing the very next day. It's in the oral mentioning list, and then you tell the judges that this is the urgency. So I think with this, there's a very strong mechanism to also kind of take care of some urgent cases.
What's one thing about litigation costs that you think clients should know from day one?
I think this is a important questions, because a lot of clients don't know that cost also varies from court to court, uh, and also case to case. A cost may be very different from for a writ. A cost may be very different for a SLP, or even from High Court and Supreme Court, it may be very different. So I think a client must know is, of course, the standard cost which he has to pay for court fee, He has to pay for, the different expenses involved while filing. So if they have a notion that every case or every court has the same court fee, so that's something that the client should know that it's not like that. It may vary from court to court, and also the category of cases that are filed.
Lot of them might feel it is included in lawyer's fee. So does that happen with you also?
Yes, it does at times, because when your clerk tells you that so and so client was inquiring about uh, whether this is already included, so you have to clarify at times that this is not, and
Right.
this is separate and from the expenses.
Okay.
I would say that when I so when it comes to my chamber colleagues or even the interns who are from the Gen Z generation, it's actually fun to work with them. There's no denial of the fact. What I see is, in terms of qualities, they have set boundaries. They have, like, they really value their boundaries. They think that, okay, like, if you have to work on a Sunday, they should know the reason. They would not say no primarily, but at least, we would never go and inquire that why should I come to office on Sunday. But then I've seen that generally they would want to know as to what's the reason why I should attend office on a weekend. If there's urgent filing or if there's like conference, so you need to just explain to them. That's what I think has been the difference. And also, I think they also involve some fun element in work, which is not wrong. I feel that
That's
if
true.
they would
Yes.
just, like, I've seen few interns that they would just go for a walk to the park, or there are few interns who just like put their headphones for a while, and then if they are like really tired after the conference or after some drafting, then they just like take a 5 minutes break, go for a walk, come back. So I think they, as I said, they prioritize themselves. They prioritize timelines. They also, what the change I've seen is, they also question if you are kind of asking them to do something on a weekend, or say you're asking them to submit this draft at the earliest. They would ask that if it's when is to be filed, or if there's an urgency, or I mean, that that's something that maybe some of the people from our generation may not really do, and they would just do the work and without questioning
Yes.
as to. But I am not saying that's wrong. That's something that I think prioritizing themselves is a big lesson, which also they teach to our generation, that it's also important, and it's also bringing too much fun in what you're doing,
Yes.
and so that because you have to do this for the rest of your life. So if you take a 5 minute break, go for a walk, come back, or just like listen to some music and come back. So I think that also is a very good way and a productive way of working.
But do you think, like you said, they prioritize themselves, which is a good thing, right? But if they don't want to work, say, long hours, 14, 15 hours a day, usually in starting, you are required to work that much. So, how do you think they will sustain in the litigation profession?
I have thus far not experienced anyone saying no to work. They are hardworking. They are working, at times more than us. Like they are very, very committed to what they're doing. The only thing is that they would want an answer. They are. I mean, I think there are a lot of questions within them, that if you have to work for so and so timeline, then what is the need or what is the necessity, and if you explain them, they would do that. I don't think so that I have yet really encountered a situation where someone has said no to working 14 hours, because I think they know that it's such a profession where mostly Sundays are working for us, because Monday is a
Yes.
miscellaneous day. So I don't think so that that's a problem, but they do have a fun element which generally uh, they follow during the work cycle.
So, you walked away from a top tier law firm, Shardula Merchant Mangal Das, to build something of your own. And we know that in India, we are not taught in law school how to run a practice. So, how did you learn that, of course, it must be hard for you. So, what all things helped you learn how to run a practice?
I think that's a very interesting question, because it also leads me to go back a few years when I joined SAM, and then eventually when I started my own practice. So when I was in SAM, there was a very balanced structural life where you are part of a team. You have a balanced life because you don't have to really be bothered about your own clientele or running your own office. But then eventually, when I decided to kind of start my own practice, there were few factors which were really kind of crucial while I decided to start my own practice. There was a very close friend of mine. It was her case, and some order came in, and then she really wanted to challenge it urgently. She approached me. I was in SAM, and then at that time I felt that if I was an independent lawyer, I would not have said no, because every client can't afford the kind of fees or tier one law
Right.
firm, or for that matter, it's a very firm specific thing, or no matter, I mean, even otherwise also, uh, you can't appear in your own briefs while being in a firm. So that was a triggering point when I realized that, okay, look, if you really want to have that kind of freedom or independence, it's important to kind of run your own practice and have your own clientele when it comes to leaving the law firm. This was a crucial game changer which kind of made me to decide that I should leave the firm. And uh, so from so the time when I decided that I should leave the firm, and the time when I finally left the firm and started my own practice, that was a very uh, crucial time, because a lot of thoughts were running around in my mind, that how to start the office structure and how to kind of get your own set of juniors, your clerk, your clients, and all of this. Like every lawyer think about all of these parameters before starting their own practice. So I think at that time for me, your mentors really play a very key role, because when you have a conversation, when you really have a dialogue with them, discuss all your doubts, discuss everything that you have in mind, you do get an answer. I feel that every time I did get an answer, that if you really want to start your own, you really have to give some time. There'll be no magic which will work. So I think that really helped me, because had it not been people around me who I can discuss this with, I would not have, got that kind of motivation, or I would not have gotten that kind of answers. So like there were few standard answers which I got from everyone, is that you need to kind of be patient and trust the process, is something that I heard from everyone. So then I decided that this is something that I'll eventually will have to follow and adopt. So I did, I think, when I started my practice, I did follow that approach. I gave some time, as I really thought that there's no magic which is going to run. And even if I was free in the initial time, I did devote a lot of time to writing. That's something that even I do now. So there's a column series called Advocate's Diary, which I write often with Bar and Bench, and then we have these columns which detail and make the law easy for a layman. The purpose was accessibility. So I started with that, and then eventually also a lot of other articles. So whenever there was time, I was reading. So I think I also kind of cherished that time, because now I feel that that kind of time one may get, may not get, but whenever you have time, you should devote to reading. You should devote to writing if you're interested in that. So I would say that anyone who would eventually want to start their own practice while they have a firm exposure, from my experience, I think one, the sooner the better, because the kind of, if you kind of get into the firm, stay around for long, and then finally decide, then I mean, already are in a very comfortable zone, and you have to step out of it, and then take your own move in terms of finding your office and finding your clients and starting your own practice. So I think the sooner the better is the key. The second thing which I also found, which was very helpful, as I said, is having very good mentors around you. Like, you have to have a mentor, you have to follow their advice, and that's something that without their advice, I don't think so that even I would have taken this plunge into litigation, because anyone would get disheartened in the initial few years. I mean, anyone would feel that, I mean, there's nothing happening. To 6 months into litigation, I'm still, in the same,
Yes.
sitting in the same place, and there's no kind of speed in terms of getting clients or making your own name. So I think, which is where having a mentor really helps. And as I said, that having few other habits other than like work, of course, reading helps a lot, writing helps a lot. Also, there are people who are interested in sports, like other than work, they devote some time in sports, or all of this also, like beyond work,
Helps
people
you a
do
lot, yes.
it helps you a lot to rewind.
So let's talk about a question like everybody wants answer to it. What does an advocate in India actually earn?
I think that's a very wide question, and there's no standard answer to it. As I just mentioned, that in the initial years, the journey is really tough. So one would not really earn anything for that matter for if you directly start practicing. There's no like glorified salary as such which you earn. It is a difficult path, and does take some time for you to establish. There may be few cases where you really may uh, get a good name, or you get a good recognition, and there are exceptional situations. But in the initial few years, what everyone tells a beginner, that don't get disheartened with the kind of uh, money that you earn. And I think that's always standard approach, because the focus is always towards learning more than anything else, because these are the foundational years. If you don't kind of learn how to work, or how to kind of do your own filings or argue your own matter, then I think if the foundation is weak, it really weakens you when it comes to building your own
But
practice.
it must be quite challenging for any advocate, to manage themselves financially,
No,
right? After
definitely.
graduating, if you're not earning for say 2 3 years.
Definitely, I think that there is, and which is why now the Bar Council has also come forward, and many seniors also had, written these representations that this should not be ignored, But then I feel that that's a very varied answer if you ask that what's the earning for any lawyer, because I would just say that initial earnings are not that glamorous, because as I said, that it is a tough journey in the initial few years, but it's improving. Of course, it's improving, because in Delhi, especially in a city like Delhi or Bombay, if you're practicing and if you're not from the same city, then you can't really survive without getting a decent paycheck. Like it's very difficult to survive. So that's something that really is a big factor for anyone when it comes to starting their practice.
And how widely does that number swing, like between a young lawyer and a senior advocate in the Supreme Court? The earning
I
part.
think tremendous, because, and which is why I said that, they have to give some time and they have to spend some time learning. But then it is the number is the difference is tremendous.
So here is a trap that almost every litigator falls into. That is, like you said, in the initial years, it's very difficult to build practice to earn. So they are undercharging for the work that they are doing. So how do you think they should decide what fee to charge?
I think it's also, there's no standard answer to it. It really depends from case to case and from lawyer to lawyer, and there's no standard approach to it.
Are there any parameters that you usually take into consideration while quoting? Because there is no, like you said, there is no standard formula for it. So a lot of people want to know, how do I price my services?
I really wouldn't have a standard answer for this
Okay.
also, because there are many. So Supreme Court also have a legal services, the authority. So there are many clients who cannot pay anything. So it's not like it's an expensive affair overall. There are clients, and there's a authority which takes care of the legal services cell. I am also part of that cell, and we do many matters, file those matters, appear in those matters pro bono without charging anything. So it really depends. Like it depends on various things. It depends on the kind of matter, the record, because in Supreme Court everything is translated and typed in and everything has to be in English. If there's a big fat brief like of like say 4,000 pages, which is coming in a regional language, say Tamil or Telugu, entire thing is translated. So there are various factors involved when you really determine a
Right. Got it.
structural fee for it.
So you have interned with some of the leading lawyers in the country, including Mr. Ram Jethmalani. So can you tell us, like, how did you secure these internships during your law school?
I think that was again a structured approach. As I said in the beginning, that I kind of drew a roadmap that in these 5 years, how much time I would like to spend in the trial court, how much time I would like to spend in the high court, and also again eventually how many years I want to spend in the Supreme Court. So this was a large plan. Of course, there were changes here and there. So when I was done with my High Court internship, I came here for a Supreme Court internship. I was interning with Mr. Mohan Parasran, who was the then Solicitor General. And then when I was interning with him, a co-intern of mine told me that I have interned with Ram sir and how the experience looked like. And I was so fascinated to hear
Yes.
his stories that he was very kind to share his email address, and he said that you can also apply and take your chance and try your luck. But then I wrote to him the very same day that I'm wanting to apply, and I still remember that I applied like some 9-10 months in advance for the internship, and then to my surprise, I did get a confirmation email, and when I met Sir for the first time, and I mean, I don't think so that there can be a better mentor, because it was even if you sit and observe him, there was so much to learn. It was not like only if you see him in the courtroom you learn something. Even if you just sit and observe him taking notes while he's preparing during a conference or preparing his brief or having a conversation with the client, there was indeed a lot to learn.
Okay, so you were also representing one of the petitioners in the Sabrimala nine-judge bench matter, right? So can you tell us how different the preparation was for that?
I think a 9 judge bench in terms of preparation is different because it is, of course, historical, so to say. There are very few 9 judge benches which are constituted. A case is already been heard by few constitutional benches before it comes to the 9 judge bench. So, in terms of preparation, I think the key role while we were preparing is firstly to find out what are the authorities that the 9 judge bench is looking at, to prepare it from an angle where you don't miss out even a single thing, because you're arguing on a very very important constitutional question of law. You also have to read not like the judgment thoroughly, which are in question and which you think are likely to be examined while they're dealing with the issue. uh, and reading the judgment means that you have to also be thorough with the dissenting opinion. You have to just read the different judgments which surround that kind of question of law. So, preparation is different because you have to be thorough in terms of the authorities, you have to be thorough in terms of what is to be argued, and also you have to be thorough in terms of what has already been argued so that there's no repetition as such. Because, there's limited time. There is a duration of timeline which has now been given to all the lawyers who are arguing that they should not go beyond the timeline which has been indicated. And I think it's been a lovely journey while we were preparing for this. I was briefing Mr. Sham Devan in this matter, and we've had like rounds and rounds of conferences before we finally got our chance to argue. And I think in those conferences also, that was a great learning experience, because there were a lot of like every day we were changing our argument strategy, or okay, this is already covered, so we're not going to repeat this. So we just go to the other argument, enhance that argument, also kind of just attend that hearing the entire day to just think of other arguments which are also questions which are falling from the bench. So you go back, you prepare your own notes, and then kind of, so it's a very engaging and a tremendously learning process, because you really, in those days when the matter was heard, I don't think so that during the court hours we really did anything else but just observing. We couldn't, because we need to know what's going on. We need to know the arguments, we need to know what's the strategy and what is our strategy going to be.
So, how do you come up with these arguments? Like you said, every day you had to chase the arguments, right? So, is there any particular strategy which helps you as a lawyer to build strong arguments?
Yeah, I think the most important strategy is also to understand the mind of the judge. Because while a matter goes on, there are various questions which flow from the bench. And if you understand that, what kind of questions are flowing from the bench and what actually they are looking towards, like what's the question of law they are wanting to us to argue on, I think that really changes a lot of parameters, because then you start diverting your focus towards that point of research. So that is one. And the second is also what is, as I said, that you don't need to repeat in such bench, like, whenever there's a constitution of a 9 judge bench or a 7 judge bench, there is limited time. So you can't afford to repeat what has already been argued. So, in terms of strategy, usually you have to follow what is falling from the bench. What are the questions which are been framed by the bench? There are many times oral observations which have been made by the judges while a matter is going on. Those are very important because they are hearing a very important, fundamentally important constitutional issue, and so you need to keep a track of it, and that's very important in such hearings.
So, do you think live streaming of these matters has been helpful?
I think immensely, because even if you end up missing any part of that particular hearing, you can always go back to that part of the hearing, and you can observe that on the Supreme Court website. It's readily available. The second thing is also, I've heard a lot of people really watching the live proceedings who have nothing to do with law, but they are just generally
And I've seen so
inquisitive.
many videos are flowing on Instagram from the, streaming.
Yes,
So,
and I've heard so many lawyers,
yes.
like from Bombay, from Chennai, from like down south, from MP. Like they would really feel privileged to see those live proceedings
Yes.
and to witness it live, because if they're not able to come to Delhi, I mean that's a phenomenal
It's a lot of
experience for
learning also for them now that they can, watch these.
Definitely. And I think not only lawyers, even general citizens who are generally interested in that subject matter, there are many people who would watch the live proceedings and they would like to see how a 9 judge bench hearing goes on.
Yes.
So I think that has been quite helpful to general citizens as well as to lawyers.
So every lawyer dreams of arguing before the Honorable Supreme Court, right? And it's rare to build a sustainable practice there. And if you argue before a judge, right, two judges can react in completely different ways. So how do you read a bench and adapt in real time?
I think when you start arguing a matter, you have to be very conscious of the questions also which are falling from the bench. You can't just argue. You are arguing on North Pole, judges are going on South Pole. You can't, like, you have to also be coordinating in such a manner that you keep answering what is falling from the judges. There may be, as you said, there may be a situation where one judge is asking some question and the other judge is asking completely a different question. So one has to be prepared. I think the only answer is to be prepared with the brief, and also been able to answer what is falling from the bench, because there may be a situation where they ask you a question on some connected matter altogether, which may have been decided by that bench, or that question is pending before that bench. So I think all of that research really helps while you argue a matter, because you're not taken by a surprise that okay, something like this has already been decided or something like this is already pending.
So if you had absolutely nothing today, no contacts, no pedigree, no mentor at all, then what is the exact roadmap that you would have followed to build a Supreme Court practice?
I would say, again, experiments which are in the form of internships, as I said, because without those experimentations, without those kind of experiences, I would really not know what I ultimately want to do. And I've always said this, and I also say this to my junior colleagues and also interns who come for internships, that if you're not, I mean, primarily you should be loving what you're doing. If you don't, because you have to do this for the rest of your life. So if you are not liking what you're doing, you really will have no interest, down the years this will not fascinate you, or this will not be like, motivating you to wake up to, or to, if you're working on a weekend, if you're working overnight on a draft or something is urgently has to be filed. It should be also something that you want to do. It should not come as a pressure. So if I would, as your question said, have nothing, and I would have to start from scratch, I think experiments, and also the second thing is mentor. I don't think so that without a mentor anyone can really adopt, kind of follow a path which is going to be without a mentor, because you can always, you have to follow someone's path or someone's journey. In the sense of following, I mean that you have to kind of kind of get examples from someone's journey, that okay, I mean, this is the person I really look up to. And and you can always, with your mentor, discuss your doubts, have a conversation that I also want to start my practice, or what are the uh, downsides, and what do you think can be the advices, or so I think that really helps anyone to adapt a path which looks dangerous to begin with, but then that really helps.
So years of preparation and lakhs of student in the NEET UG crisis, right? It broke trust between the students and the systems, and you were arguing for FIMA in that matter, right? So can you tell us like what exactly were you asking the court to do in that matter?
So a very interesting matter, of course, it's sub judice, so I can't disclose a lot of things. But primarily, what our ask was that there was a paper leak. 22 lakh students appeared in the examination. The exam was conducted. Many people did the exam to the best of their abilities, and they were expecting a fabulous score. We were very happy, and then they came back home, and then there was a surprise, and they were devastated to hear the news that there was a paper leak and it's cancelled, and then they'll again have to rewrite it. So while all of this was going on, there were few people who had approached me to file this petition urgently. And they actually, while I was preparing this, I also spoke with a lot of students who wrote the examination, and I could hear from them their pain, because this is a very nascent stage in anyone's career. They are just 12th pass people, like students, and they prepare for this exam for almost 2 years. So 11th and 12th they give to preparation, they go to coaching centers, prepare for it overnight, and then it's a very, very crucial stage in anyone's career to write this examination. And anyone would want to give their best to qualify this. But if they really wake up to this sudden devastating news such as a paper leak, they are really shattered from within. So hearing all of this, then we prepared the petition overnight. It was filed urgently, and we'd kind of sought an urgent hearing, and the Supreme Court issued notice. And then they also said that they would like to monitor it because it's a very serious issue. So there have been few developments. The government is asked to now file its affidavit regarding the steps they are going to take for the future years, because uh, in the recent hearings, the judges have referred to institutionalization of the National Testing Agency, that's in NTA. So they said that it's not like we're only going to examine it for this year or for next year. We're just looking at institutionalization of NTA. So that's something that's a very important step in the entire hearing. So it's pending. It's now, in fact, listed next week.
So you mentioned about NTA, right? A lot of people have heard about it but don't know what NTA is and what happens when it fails. So who's
So
accountable?
So NTA is the National Testing Agency which conducts the examination. And when it fails, of course, that's the entire prayer and one of the points in the writ petition, which is accountability. That in such a case, who is going to be accountable? Because this can't be repeated. This can't be every, 2024, such an incident happened. And again, 2026, there was a paper leak. Although 2024, it was not determined as a paper leak or a systemic failure. But in 26, again, it happened. In 24, it was localized kind of a paper leak. But then this time, I think the responsibility, of course, like NTA is the exam conducting body. So that's one of the crucial questions which is pending before the court.
So, if a neat student or worried parent is listening to this podcast right now, so what would be your advice to them? That whether do you think the system will be able to fix this?
As I said, the matter is pending, so I really can't comment much on the facts. But I think that having going to the orders which are already passed by the court, there is a direction to the government to give a roadmap of what they are going to do for future years and file an affidavit. So that's kind of that shows that there is some kind of uh, you know steps which the government is going to show the court what they are taking in the sense of next year what they are going to do, and for future years how they are going to take it.
So, one single Supreme Court judgment can reshape the life of billions of people who have not even read about it, right? So, what does it mean when we say that this judgment sets a precedent?
I think presidential value is very, very high when it comes to any court for that matter. And when it comes to Supreme Court, those precedents are also binding authorities. So, I mean, if you see from that angle that had there been no Keshwanand Bharti, or had there been no Minerva Mills or MC Mehta, or Putta Swami for that matter, then there have been no landmark authorities which are like generations remember. So those judgments are very, very crucial in the sense of landmark authorities, and also while you argue or prepare a petition on a similar subject matter, your case really starts from there. You know, if you see the constitutional development, a major part of it has, I mean, if you see any constitutional matter been argued, any even in Sabrimala, a lot of authorities which have been referred are all decided authorities by the courts. So the presidential value is very, very high, and I think any brief which has been prepared, any draft which has been prepared, the prima facie focus is to first research and do your own research whether there is a similar issue which has already been decided by any court, and that's something that really helps your kind of drafting the strategy to build the entire case.
So, was there any case, not necessarily a famous one, but it rewired how you think as a lawyer?
I think many cases for that matter, but if I have to pick up one, then I would say a recent, but it's still pending. But then a case in which we really had to. This was a temple related, one of the very renowned temples. We were for the management committee, and then while we were preparing for the case, I really had to go through all the scriptures of 1500s, and starting from 1500s till now, and we read a lot of literatures around that subject. We read interpretation of article 25, 26, and had a lot of these conversation to understand, like even I think that was a very fascinating literature.
So, AI is coming for the profession, right? So, do you think AI is a threat to litigation, or it's the biggest opportunity the profession has ever seen?
I think the answer to is that how you see AI and how you use AI. AI has to be used as a slave. You can't, AI can never dominate your thinking. So that's something. If you do it from that angle, or if you really take use of AI where you want to use it, and however also apply your own mind, then I think it's a great tool. But as I said, there has to be a nuanced way of using it, and you should know where it is to be used and how it is to be used. Right? There are many interns who come to my chamber, and then when I give them a research point, or if I ask them to draft something, and then they get that draft to me within seconds, I can figure out that this is AI. So I think, and I also tell them that if I am able to figure out, even if in case this is filed somewhere, the judge is also going to figure out that this is AI driven.
Right.
So that is something that one should understand, that it has to be used as a slave, and it has to be used with a lot of cautiousness. I think now the Supreme Court has also come up with the draft AI rules, where they have invited suggestions, and it also provides that there has to be a compulsory disclosure that you are using AI. because there have been some, situations or which were reported that certain judgments were
Yes,
cited which
same.
don't exist at all.
But do you
So
think clients will register, like if we are supposed to disclose, right, that this work is done using AI? So clients will also register that?
I think from a client's perspective, it has to be something they are also,
Yes.
trusting you in this entire process. So they don't know whether you're doing it through AI or you're doing it yourself or you're, reading the citations yourself. So they are just trusting you while you're drafting a petition or while you're arguing a case. So I think that disclosure is something which will help everyone because and also build some kind of accountability because as I said that it's a great tool if you really have to read something or create a structure and then start working or start like it'll give you a broad blueprint, but then you have to really sit through and read line by line and really like it can just give you an overview, but it can't explain what the provision says or how you have to apply it. All of that has to be done by the lawyer.
But from your experience, like, is it saving a lot of time? Because I know when we were interning in law firms, when we were given research work, it used to take a lot of time, right? But now interns are giving you, say, research work in seconds. So, do you think AI has saved a lot of time, or because you have to review it, so it has increased your job a lot more?
No, I think it is not in, I mean, I would say that we are at a stage where we are still figuring out how to use AI. So there have been like 2 3 situations where I told everyone that this is something that AI has to be used in a balanced way and you have to kind of do your own research simultaneously. So there have been 2 3 situations where I had to kind of do it from scratch, but now everyone knows that where and how it has to be done, at least in my chambers. But then I feel that with AI, as far as time is concerned, it has helped in some extent. Like if say for example, if you want to know the latest development in particular any question of law, if you get a roadmap, if you just get like few bullet points, you can't straight away like blindly rely on those bullet points for your own understanding. Like if you're sitting in the courtroom, if you really want an answer to something, you can just get an overview, but you really have to go back and do your own research whether that's
And I think
reliable or not.
when we are doing this, your opponent is also going to get same answer, right? If we are writing similar thing on AI and the answer is always same for both the sides. So that is also something, I think uniqueness is something that advocates have to definitely maintain even if they are using AI, right?
Yes, definitely. And also, as I said, that, say for example, if you have to prepare a SLP, you cannot use AI. So you should know where to use AI.
Yes.
You can ask AI what has been, like, say, development in so and so field. You may get 10 prompts and you may just, for your own understanding, just read it and for your own understanding, kind of make your mind, okay, like this is how I have to structure my research, but you can't really just copy paste it in your draft because that's something that's not going to help anyone. And there are many situations, like I said, that there have been reported instances where some cases are cited which don't exist. So that is because people have not gone back and checked whether this
Yes.
exists, don't exist at all, what happens. So that's something that I think will happen over time because, as I said, this is something very new
Yes.
to everyone.
So, in the age of AI, right, if I am a first year law student and I want to start my career in this age of AI, so how should I prepare myself?
I think it's easier, not only AI, like generally, if you see social media platforms like LinkedIn and all, the presence has increased. If I see 15 years back when I was in law school, the presence of LinkedIn and all of that has increased a lot, and that has an added advantage because people keep seeing these opportunities. Like there are internship opportunities being posted, there are placement opportunities being posted. So all of that was not there back then. uh, but then I think for a first year beginner, they should keep a check. They should be on LinkedIn. They should like keep a general check of what are those opportunities if they are. And I think many people said that it's very convenient platform to be connected to everyone. So even if they've done internship in a chamber, and they it's not like they lose connect altogether, because they are somehow connected on LinkedIn or some social media platform. So that always helps. But then, even for a beginner, even if he creates a CV on a AI, that's not going to help him. So, from a standpoint of doing research on AI, or like building your CV on AI, or building, getting ideas on AI, that can only be th- like that can just be prompts for you, but you have to do your own check. You have to meet people to understand that how your journey can be. Like, if you just type on AI, what, as a first year law student, which internships I should do, so it can give you 10 answers.
Yes.
It can also tell you that you can intern in the Supreme Court. But unless you talk to a practitioner and get an idea that, it may not be the best thing to intern in the Supreme Court in the first year. So it has to be a balanced approach, a combination of factors. You can only get AI answers for your understanding, but then you have to also do a lot more other things.
So now I have rapid fire round for you. One skill every law student must master.
I think hard work.
One mistake every young lawyer must avoid.
I think overconfidence.
One myth about the Supreme Court practice that you think public doesn't know.
One myth. I can't really think of one myth. At Supreme Court, people don't know.
People won't believe.
I think to be very well prepared for an admission hearing, because people don't know. People think that on the first hearing you will automatically a notice will be issued and you'll get entry, and then your case will go on. But it's not like that.
Choose one, research or arguments.
I think arguments.
One must read book for every lawyer.
I think Constitution to begin with, and if you ask a book generally to read, then Roses in December. That's one of my favorite reads. That's MC Chagla's autobiography.
Okay. And one legal right you wish that every Indian citizen should know about.
I think these days right to privacy, which people should know about.
Right, it was not there initially, so
Yes, yeah.
now people should know, especially with internet use that we
Yeah,
are
and
doing.
what, yeah, I mean, there has to, like, people don't know about end-to-end encryption.
Yes.
People don't know about the developments after Aadhaar judgment.
Best advice you ever received from your mentors in one sentence.
Keep faith in the process.
Okay. Now, so there is somebody who is listening to this podcast right now, maybe a young lawyer or a student or general public. So, what do you want to suggest to them if they are just starting their career or they're stuck somewhere? So, what should keep them going? Any final words you have for the viewers?
I think, as I began saying, that you have to have a roadmap that really helps. I mean, one would think that how can I have roadmap when I'm in first year? But eventually things can be little here and there, but you should have a strategy that really helps a lot in terms of planning things, in terms of knowing how you will devote time. So I think and that's for a matter of fact, that's true for lawyers also. That a roadmap really helps a lot, and also trusting the entire process. Don't lose hope or don't lose faith that I'm like now 2 years in the profession, nothing really great is happening, so I can just switch to law firm, or I can switch to other chamber. So that really, you have to trust the process. You have to give some time, And I also feel that it's very, very crucial to have a mentor. It's very, very crucial to follow someone's footsteps, and also, to have discussions with that person, whomsoever you want to, like, at least discuss your doubts. You have to have someone in the profession who has been there to discuss your doubts, to discuss like whatever you have in your mind. And there is no substitute to toiling. There is no substitute to your hard work, as it's like said that law is a jealous mistress, and you really have to uh, put in a lot of hard work to uh, learn, to refine. And even at if you attain the age of 80, even if you become the country's best lawyer, even at that stage you can't confidently say that, uh, I know everything about law, because there are so many changes, there are precedents, there are judgments. So you have to keep reading, keep learning, to enhance your skills, and also to keep refining your skills and develop better and better each day.
So thank you so much, Tanvi. It was wonderful hosting you on this podcast.
Thank you so much. I also had a lovely time. And in fact, it seems like I was just having a general conversation with you.
Yes, likewise.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.